Morning Majlis, talking the stories that are shaping headlines. This is Pulse 95.
We've got some vaccine news for you this morning, and this news comes after just the other day we were talking about how Pfizer and BioNTech said their vaccine was more than 90% effective. Well, now a second COVID-19 vaccine also appears highly effective in preventing illness following exposure to the virus that causes the disease. And the biotech company Moderna Inc. is behind this vaccine. They said that its experimental vaccine was 94.5% effective in preventing the disease, according to an analysis of its clinical trial.
Yeah, for the race of the COVID-19 vaccine, Moderna seems to be doing very well and going ahead. Yes, as you said, Ahmed, the Moderna vaccine reduced the risk of COVID-19 infection by 95%. There were 95 cases of infection among patients who received placebo in the company's 30,000 patient study. There were only 5 infections in patients who developed COVID-19 after receiving Moderna's vaccine. And according to the director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, Anthony Fauci, he admitted the preliminary data for the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccines, the only two so far to have early estimates of vaccine efficacy. And he's saying they are better than he had expected. I would like to say, I would have predicted it, but I would not have. So this is what Fauci said, who has often said he would have been satisfied with COVID vaccines that were only 70% or 75% of efficacy. He said, honestly, I would not have expected that. I thought that was too much to hope for. But yeah, Moderna also released data about the number of patients who had severe COVID-19. There were 11 cases of severe disease, all of them in the placebo group. Another point of encouragement for Fauci, of course. In addition, he said there was always the concern, since the primary endpoint of the trial is just clinically apparent disease. So how do we know it's going to have an impact on severe disease? And the results with severe disease were striking. 11-0 is very impressive. So this is what he had to say. And further, he said that the Moderna vaccine appears to have been protective in important subsets of participants, the elderly and people from racial and ethnic minority groups, the latter of which make up 37% of the Moderna trial population.
It all seems like a little bit of a...
dose of hope.
Dose of hope, you could say. Dose of hope. But
Yeah.
to me, it looks a lot more like, what can we say? Auction.
Yes.
90% effective, my vaccine.
Yeah.
Sputnik 5 comes back and say 92%.
92,
It's like, oh, really? And then Moderna says
Yeah,
95%. Raise me. And the rest are saying checkmate at the moment. So we will see what happens next. But look, there's a bit of a difference. The Pfizer vaccine is, what we do understand, is it needs to be stored at minus 72 degrees Celsius. Minus 75 degrees Celsius. That's a lot, and very, very freezing. And that's where Emirates is partnered as a transport partner.
Yep.
Moderna says they're going to be going through or applying for the regulatory approvals in the coming weeks, and they expect to have at least 1 billion doses ready by next year, and that's their plan. And they're very similar in terms of how they trigger an immune response by being injected directly. But to what extent are they that effective, as in how long can that person who's been vaccinated be immune for? That needs to still be seen. But we do know that the immune response has been very quick, and that's why these percentage of the efficacy are quite high. But to what extent can they be for 6 months, 7 months, 8 months? We don't know.
Exactly. Both Moderna's trial and Pfizer's are continuing, and efficacy figures could decline by the time the trials are complete. So it is often the case that obviously a vaccine performs less well in the real world than it does in the setting of a clinical trial. So this is something to also put in mind. And furthermore, data from the two trials do not indicate how long the protection afforded by the vaccines lasts. And that's the most important part about a vaccine as well. And that can only be determined over time as large numbers of people are vaccinated. So the Moderna results, like those from Pfizer, were disclosed in a press release, not a scientific article, and limited details are public.
Yeah, limited details are public. That's what epidemiologists have been saying as well, is that we need to wait until the entire data has been released and until the clinical trial is complete before coming to a clear evaluation of this. What we have at the moment is a very promising story. It injects a lot of hope into people, but we got to wait for more detail to come out. More on the differences between the Pfizer vaccine and the Moderna vaccine. Pfizer invested $2 billion of its own money in researching and developing its vaccine, but Moderna is part of the U.S. government's Operation Warp Speed, which is designed to accelerate the development of a vaccine, to erase the financial risk of developing it, and to provide upfront funding to companies to help coordinate those clinical trials. And Moderna received nearly $1 billion from the U.S. government to support research and development. Both companies have contracts to sell 100 million doses to the U.S. government. Moderna projects it can produce 20 million doses by the end of the year, enough for 10 million people to get both shots. So at the moment, Moderna is eyeing FDA approval for emergency use in the United States first, before we move on to spreading or distributing the vaccine elsewhere. With regards to side effects, with Moderna, so far they've been mostly mild or moderate, including pain at the injection site, fatigue, headache, and muscle pain, according to the company's press release. But regulators at the Food and Drug Administration must review the evidence for the safety of both Moderna and Pfizer vaccines before approval. So far that's not been confirmed, but the early indication there is that it's heading in a good direction and should be successful.
Yeah, it's just one company's word against the other, really, at the moment. It's just statements coming out as a press release, as opposed to, here's the scientific data, these are the volunteers that we've used, and these are their contact details should you wish to verify them further or have this open data. That's still been restricted, so we can't say much about without seeing the scientific data, but so far it just spreads a wave of optimism, and once again the Asian shares have been edging higher off the back of more positive news. Well, time now for us to take a bit of a breather. We shall return right after a bit of a short break, and when we do come back, we'll continue the discussions, particularly about global developments. Stay with us. This is The Morning Majlis, only on Pulse 95.
Join the conversation with The Morning Majlis, Pulse 95.
This is a very Rania story. Very Rania segment indeed. Because Rania's a big fan of, well, she's a former pharmaceutical industry professional. And is also massive
Speaking of career shifts that we talked about yesterday.
Yeah, exactly. And you're also a Warren Buffett fan.
Big Warren Buffett fan.
So Berkshire Hathaway has made some kind of an announcement.
Yeah, Warren Buffett's Berkshire Hathaway is making a big bet on the healthcare sector at a time when the COVID-19 pandemic obviously continues to be a major crisis in the U.S. and everywhere in the world. But Berkshire Hathaway bought new shares in pharmaceutical companies AbbVie, Bristol Myers Squibb, Merck, and Pfizer during the third quarter of the year. Pfizer obviously as we talked about it, has a promising coronavirus vaccine in the works, but the company's stock fell yesterday after Moderna announced progress for its own vaccine that we also just talked about earlier in the show today. So the company disclosed its latest holdings in a filing with the Securities and Exchange Commission after the closing bell yesterday. And the investments in the big drug stocks are also noteworthy, considering that Buffett and Berkshire, along with Amazon and banking giant JP Morgan Chase, are partners in a healthcare effort known as Haven.
Yeah, and Buffett and his team might be betting that big pharma companies would play an increasingly important role in the global economy, both during and after the coronavirus pandemic, in light of announcements made by Pfizer that a COVID-19 vaccine is extremely effective in its late trials. Berkshire Hathaway also added a new $280 million stake in T-Mobile to its portfolio, boosted its General Motors and Kroger holdings, and trimmed its position in Apple, easily its biggest holding, by about 3.7% or 36 million shares as well. And close watchers of the company were expecting significant changes to Buffett's portfolio. Berkshire's third quarter earnings showed $17.6 billion in stock purchases, $12.8 billion in stock sales, equating to $4.8 billion in net stock purchases within the period.
Yeah, this healthcare bet is structured similarly to the more than $6 billion wager that Buffett had made on 4 largest U.S. airlines. Buffett sold Berkshire's airline holdings in April, saying that the pandemic had changed the industry and made its outlook uncertain. Berkshire also has more than 90 operating units, including Geico Car Insurance, BNSF Railroad, and Dairy Queen ice cream as well. But one thing in particular that catches our attention as well is how these pharmaceutical companies have been operating like an auction with 90% efficacy. Sputnik 5 raises the bar a little bit, but saying 92%, and then comes in Moderna, says 95%. Well, the morning Majlis motivational vaccine has 100.5% efficacy. So I'd appreciate if Warren Buffett invests here, and we can talk about your dairy ice cream all day long. Yeah, why not? Just invest here. It'll be okay. But investing in something is something that we'll be talking about later. Just after the sports headlines, investing in yourself. Can you invest enough water in your body? Have you been hydrating well? Have you been drinking enough water during the day? That is the question that we're asking you. Text lines remain open, 4215. So far, looking at my calculation, I've only consumed 300 millilitres of water in the last 2 hours. It's not enough, according to some estimates, especially if we're talking a lot.
Yeah.
A lot throughout the day.
True.
Let us know on the text lines 4215. Are you keeping your target of 2 litres a day, 3 litres a day, 4 litres a day, a couple of gallons a day? Never know. How much water do you drink in a day? In line with lots of water, here's a bit of water for you. Courtesy of Pharrell Williams and Beyonce, and we shall return right after the sports headlines. This is The Morning Majlis, only on Pulse 95.
If you liked this episode of The Morning Majlis, drop a like and subscribe.
95.
Be sure to follow us on Instagram for all our daily updates and top stories.